year and a half ago, India became the world's 5th largest economy. In market exchange rates, right? Not purchasing power parity terms. This is really a big deal. It means that India is now larger as an economy than the economy of the United Kingdom. That is a big deal. And that puts it in kind of different category. India has not been a member of the G7 group of countries, but has increasingly been invited to join G7 summits as an invited guest. India is a member of the G20 since its inception, because it is one of the world's largest economies, even before it became the 5th largest. The past year, you saw the Indian government take the G20 presidency, which means that India hosted all of the G20 meetings throughout the course of 2023, and really make that kind of an international calling card. It was also a domestic calling card showcasing the way that India's Prime Minister had brought visibility for India on the world stage. Maybe the show can speak to some of the domestic impacts of this issue. But I think you do see India becoming much more of like this country on speed dial, certainly for the United States. 20 years ago, it was probably more challenging to enter a foreign policy discussion and have India be among the top 5 countries that might come up. And I think that's not as much of a challenge anymore. You see the re-emergence of the Quad, not simply as a one-time, one-off consultation on humanitarian assistance, which it was after the Asian tsunami, but the revived formulation of the Quad, which began in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, has really expanded. It's become a functioning multilateral organization. It is a small consultation, but it has big ambitions, and India is playing a very significant role in that. It is the only non-US ally that's part of this formulation, and it's ended up being okay. It seems not to have created big challenges for that coordination, and the Quad is seeking to create both a security, public health, supply chain, economic set of consultations for the betterment of the broader Indo-Pacific. I wouldn't have imagined this in that way 15 years ago, for example. So I think this is a pretty positive set of outcomes. Now, I will say a couple things on the domestic side, and the show may have a different view or may have different views here. There is some concern among different parts of the United States and U.S. civil society on some of the direction of India's politics, the role for minorities in India's democracy. Nobody's arguing that India doesn't hold free and fair elections. Of course it does. It's an intensely large democracy. But I think there are some worries and fears that the kind of open, more ecumenical kind of India is changing. And so you do hear from different parts of the US government, from different organizations in the United States that follow these issues closely, that they're wondering about the direction that India's heading. So that, I think, will percolate out in future conversations. Let's see.
Before I came to this event this afternoon, I actually went back and skimmed your book from many years ago, Time Has Come. And in some sense, you were almost prophetic because you caught the wave at the earliest phase of India's emergence as a great power. Ashok, how do you see it from inside India? Now, we see India sort of bursting on the world stage in the last few years, very much revolving around the activity of the Prime Minister and his own sort of persona. But how do you see it from within India?
So the past 5 years especially, this is a 10-year period we're discussing, but they're actually 2 separate 5-year periods, which are both very different. The past 5 years have been a very gritty period for India. They've been very eventful, they've been packed with achievements, but they've also been packed with challenges. They have been gritty, like for India, as for the rest of the world, but perhaps more so for India. COVID, the pandemic, the Chinese challenge at our borders, 100,000 troops, unprecedented in history. There's the whole sort of meltdown of the global economic compact. We saw that with President Trump and then President Biden actually continuing that sense of contestation with China. And the Ukraine war, and of course the Middle East goes back to the worst state in an ugly way a few months ago. Now, this has been a gritty and challenging period, but also a very clarifying period. it has got many Indians who still thought there was room on that fence off the fence. We moved off the fence. We know where we are. We know who our friends are. We know where our interests lie. And essentially, we've taken a deep breath with the China relationship. And I don't think there's any going back now. China is an overwhelming factor when India looks at its security, its economic agenda, its global strategy, its global South strategy, its Indian Ocean strategy. China is just overwhelming. And this obviously means that countries that share our concerns about China are just countries we become much closer to. So in that sense, the US relationship today is different not just from what it was 15 years ago, but what it was 5 years ago. Now, the past 10 years have also been a period of great achievement in terms of infrastructure, digitalization, formalization of the economy. To use one metric, we had 74 airports when Mr. Modi took office, today we have 149. Much of the previous 74 have been upgraded as well. I can cite similar figures for roads, highways, ports, whatever you want. There have also been strong foreign policy linkages with key countries, the US, the UAE, the Gulf countries, the EU, the FTA negotiations, which will conclude someday when we all have grandchildren, have begun again. But in a sense, India's transformation is contingent upon its more energetic foreign policy and domestic transformation, but much more than that, an economic transformation, which will really add to its composite national power. The ground for that has been laid, whether in terms of infrastructure or international partnerships. But the next 5 years will determine exactly what we can achieve. And that's what makes this 5-year period very crucial. And this is not just me saying it because there's an election ahead of us. If you look at the economic strategy of the government as spelled out by the Prime Minister, this could be validated. India's economy today is about $4 trillion, give or take a bit. About 15% of that is manufacturing. The government says it wants to move the economy to a roughly $10 trillion size by the second half of the 2030s, 25% of which is manufacturing, which is a very stiff metric, very, very stiff. But that's about a little over a decade away. So if we have to reach anywhere close to that number, the next 5 years have to be transformational, especially with the global opportunities in supply chains. So we are at the cusp of a make or break 5-year period. Now, coming to the issue you raised about domestic tensions and domestic issues, look, they're not altogether absent or not denying that. But frankly, in a time of global stress, of domestic stress, of economic restlessness, of social and economic dislocation, many democracies are facing such challenges. And social media adds to that. It amplifies everything. So such challenges exist in the US, exist in the UK, exist in France, and in India as well. I would still say that while ugly things are sometimes said, and ugly things sometimes happen, the differential between how much is said and how much is done is still fairly manageable. The say-do ratio, as it were, is still fairly manageable. And I think, I do believe the senior leadership of the country and the government is cognizant that it must remain manageable. Also, I work with companies now. I work with investors trying to come into India, or sometimes new companies trying to go abroad. When big business from India, from Korea, from Japan contemplates the investment landscape across the world, it does see social tensions in many countries. It sees social tensions in India as well. It asks questions about that. But compared to many other countries, the social tensions in India seem relatively benign. While not altogether absent, they seem relatively benign. So we need to consider that as well.
So let me ask you, because I think when we look for the next 5 years, and we look at the next 5 years with the prism of the last 5, there is the sense that Prime Minister Modi pursued two sets of policies concurrently. One was putting in place the foundations for long-term economic growth, all the things that you described in terms of economic investments and so on and so forth. But he also pursued what one senior Indian official once said, a strategy of consolidating his Hindu base. And he did that because it goes back to sort of the antecedents of the BJP. And he checked off all the boxes in the last 5 years with respect to Article 370 and so on and so forth. The next 5 years, he's got this vision now of Viksit Bharat, and he wants India to become essentially a developed country by 2047, right? How is he going to balance these two sort of strands? The strand of consolidating power for the BJP, which clearly seems to be obviously aim, and understandably all political parties want to be in power permanently, while at the same time putting in place the building blocks for growth. I mean, is there a sense within India that there might be trade-offs between these two goals, or can both be pursued concurrently without relatively high costs?
You know, astute politicians straddle multiple goals, not just in India, but in many countries. So, I can answer that question about the domestic agenda, which you referred to Kashmir, for instance, in multiple ways. One, with two successive majority governments, two successive victories, issues that mattered to the core of the BJP needed to be addressed. You couldn't keep ignoring them and saying, look, you've given us two good mandates, now produce do something else. It would have been dishonest. Kashmir was crying out for some sort of a response. It has been for years, you know that better than I do. 40,000 people killed over 20 years. Is Kashmir better off than it was 5 or 7 years ago? I would say it is better off. Is it where I'd like it to be? No, not at all. But some steps needed to be taken, and that response was popular. It had appeal across India. Because in a sense, Kashmir became the final fault line that the Indian state was battling. Relatively speaking, the fault lines in Mizoram and even Nagaland have been pacified one way or the other. Sometimes we compromise, sometimes with military action, whatever it is. Even the Maoist challenge, though there has been an incident only recently, is not what it was even 20 years ago. So Kashmir, in a sense, became the fault line on which the entire country's eyes were focused. You know, I'll give you one example. When we had the Bagalkot incident in 2019, an Indian pilot was captured by Pakistan. His release became the highest watched event across news, social, soap operas, everything in Kerala. And 20 years ago, you know, both of you know India, 20 years ago, Kerala wouldn't have bothered about Kashmir. But it became over and it needed to be addressed. And then, of course, there was the Ayodhya issue, which I'm glad it's reached a solution. It has. I'm glad it's behind us. There is a lot of people are happy with the temple being built. There are also people with another view. I appreciate that. But this was something festering for years, for decades. It needed to come to a solution. And it has. It's not a perfect solution. Not everyone's happy, but it's a solution that is broadly accepted. Now, I don't think there is a desire to keep pushing and looking for other such issues and themes down the line, because the economic agenda, the economic transformation of India is extremely important, not just for the government, but for middle class India. I mean, you have a country today which has more internal migration than ever before in its history because of the macroeconomic journey. And people are conscious of that. People do recognize that identity matters, and of course it does. And as you become more prosperous, it matters even more. But the economy and the idea that India can matter much more on the world stage is an overwhelming sentiment.
atypically high growth rates now for about 30 years. If India can pull off 10% for another 20 years, it will be a 50-year run of high growth rates. So, one, is this realistic? And two, what must India do to get there, which is the more important question in my book. If you think about India's engagement with the world economically, what does India need to do to make the 10% growth rate viable?
I think you see unfolding in India actually a set of debates about what India should do to reach those high rates of growth. Is this realistic? Hard to say. There's only been a few years in which India had double-digit growth. They've been at 6, 7, 8% more recently. Of course, COVID was a major shock as it was around the world. India's now bouncing back from that, finally. But 10% is a lot, and 10% to sustain over another decade, that's going to be challenging. You see unfolding in the economic policy world, really a kind of big debate over whether India should continue its focus on trying to achieve manufacturing-led growth because of the job creation it could provide, the kind of growth that transformed the East Asian and Southeast Asian economies, or whether the space for that kind of growth is already too late on the world stage, and whether India should continue with focusing on some manufacturing, but also emphasizing opportunities and services. It's been a services leader. Services has not been able to produce jobs at scale. India has this huge youth population, needs to continually be job creating, again, for decades ahead, through 2047. It's actually really important to do that. And I think the jury is out on this. I think there's nobody who has a clear answer on exactly how a double-digit growth rate can be attained again and maintained over another decade. So you're going to see different approaches here. Prime Minister Modi has a policy focused on manufacturing, which is the same policy that the Congress-led coalition government had prior to Mr. Modi's government coming in, which just goes to show how important this is as a policy focus, right? Successive Indian governments across different parties have tried to increase the percentage of manufacturing in the Indian economy. And despite attention to this issue, actually that needle hasn't moved. It's dipped a little bit. It went from, 17% to 15, something like that. Yeah. And so that's an important question, right? How can India increase that percentage of manufacturing in the GDP? How can it do so over a long period? Does it need to do so anymore? Are there other ways that India can create jobs for this huge demographic, help the economy continue high rates of growth for that transformation of the country, not just the BJP-led country, but the successive Indian governments have been talking about for years. So after saying all that, I don't have a magic prescription here. And I think we're going to continue to see this as a big debate in Indian society, particularly among policymakers focused on the economy.
Let me jump off that set of remarks because I agree with you completely. I edited a book about 5 years ago.
I remember.
Talking about India and the quest for greatness. And one of the things we found in the work that Rakesh Mohan did actually for that book was that you can't get to these stratospheric growth rates without manufacturing. So it raises two questions that I want to pose to you, Ashok. Is capital intensive, high technology manufacturing, which is what the Prime Minister seems to be pushing very hard with Apple and semiconductors and Tesla and so on and so forth, is that the solution when India is still a labor surplus economy? So that's question number one. And two, are there other things that have to be done in the reform circuit to sort of shake the factors of production loose in order to be able to sustain this emphasis on manufacturing over the next decade? So leave the services versus manufacturing question aside because I don't think it's a particularly productive question.
You need both. You need both.
Exactly.
And for the prosperity of the Indian people, whether they have a job or don't have a job, we need jobs. So let's take it for granted. Let me put it this way. Any country, any government, Mr. Modi's government, India, any entity is going to look at opportunities where they exist, not where they should exist. So if the opportunities right now, as global supply chains are reordered, are in semiconductors, in electronics manufacturing, in electric vehicles and in green manufacturing, some of which happen to be capital intensive, Mr. Modi is not going to sit back and say, no, I have surplus labor, I'm not going to do this. It doesn't make sense. And frankly, if electric vehicles coming to India, as Musk is visiting India next week, or this weekend, sorry, it's much of the capital is going to come from him rather than from the Indian taxpayer. So it will produce jobs down the line. Not hundreds of thousands, but still a significant number. There is a larger question, which is that is manufacturing, labor-intensive manufacturing leading to exports, which is the model the East Asian tigers follow and China follow. Can that model be entirely replicated in India? Frankly, I don't think it does. It can, because I don't think there's any new China. There's no next China. We have seen a meltdown of that model, and we've seen a dispersal of that model across geographies, including here, the reindustrialization of America, which China did not have to cope with that, because India has to cope with that. India has to cope with that as a trade partner, as a competitor for investment, including American investment. China didn't. I had a major semiconductor manufacturer coming to India last year to look at investment. Three visits, intense visits, and they were looking at India, Vietnam, and Japan. And he told me, he said, Vietnam, the reddest of the red carpets, but 99 million people, very few engineers. Japan, the ecosystem is all there, but it's very expensive. India, a large number of engineers, some of them need to be reskilled, we do it, the talent pool is there, the geographical expanse is there, but no ecosystem yet. So there's no perfect answer. There's no, it's not that you can come to India and get all that you need, or you go to Vietnam and get what you need. We all get a little bit of a slice. And whatever you can grab in the next 5 years, whatever opportunity you can grab is, as manufacturing is reordered for integration, India will have to grab. And at the end of 5 years or 7 years, sit back and say, okay, this is what we managed to get, now what do we need to do in addition to this?
I understand the political logic that drives that completely. What I'm still struggling to get a fix on is how does India employ these large numbers of people who are coming into the workforce in a way that allows it to exploit the demographic dividend that we've been talking about for decades, right? And if you assume that the demographic dividend is going to last at best for another 10 years, because Indian population growth will slow. It already is in the south. I mean, fertility rates are the same as the rest of the advanced world. How does one deal with this? I mean, Tellis, do you have any sense of what the Indian discussion is about addressing this part of the labor force, which is young, not always perfectly skilled, but certainly willing to work, very aspirational? How does India work its magic to get them on board?
I think some of that conversation is about entry-level manufacturing. India is one of the world's largest textile producers. The Indian government has created a production-linked incentive in technical textiles. So again, kind of higher-level product. As I mentioned earlier, I took advantage of the fact that we were going to talk today to really look closely at the BJP's new manifesto, the platform for the elections. And there is a whole section in there that focuses on manufacturing in specific sectors, railways, airplanes, defense. I mean, they have laid out a plan of trying to become a world hub for these kinds of big industrial products. But I think it's also that's going to take some time, right? it's also the case that they'll need to be looking at front-facing services, retail, the growth of retail, small and medium enterprises, job creation in small spaces that can grow and become larger enterprises. But the government has had, and successive governments have had, a focus on micro, small, medium-scale enterprises for some time. So can it do what needs to be done to create globally competitive enterprises that can be part of these global supply chains? I think that's kind of the question mark out there.
But the ambition to become part of that global supply chain has become very clear,
very
right?
clear.
The Prime Minister said this on so many
Yeah.
occasions. Ashok, how do you reconcile this ambition with what is a complaint in the United States that has really intensified in the last few years about India's foreign trade policies? I mean, in some ways, there seems to be a sort of schizophrenia, and India seems to be negotiating ambitious FTAs with a slew of countries, in contrast to the diffidence that the Prime Minister had about FTAs in his first term. But at the same time, the objective of becoming part of a global supply chain is counteracted by the rise in tariffs, increasing protectionism, and India is not unique. I mean, we are now slowly becoming world leaders in that same path. But for India, the costs are high, right? Because we already have connectivity with the world. India is trying to build that connectivity. In a third term, will the Prime Minister sort of confront this tension?
So
Take it head on?
Okay, so FTAs, there's a bit of a history here. India signed a slew of FTAs in the early 2000s, primarily with countries to its east, ASEAN as a collective and then individual countries within ASEAN. There was an idealism to that process of, perhaps people felt that the Western industry would miraculously reorganize itself, take advantage of market access. It didn't quite work that way. It ended up providing entry for cheap imports and eventually cheap Chinese imports. And that it invited a political pushback, as it has frankly here as well. There was a correction to it when Mr. Modi came to office, because many of those things came up pretty well then. That correction, that pause, perhaps went into power, and it led to no movement in trade. And then, of course, RCEP was a defining moment when at least two Indian ministers told me that whichever way we look at it, RCEP looks to be like an FTA with China, which we don't want to do. Politically is impossible, and we become part of the Chinese system. And that was so the FTAs we've negotiated since then, the last 3 or 4 years. I wouldn't call them ambitious. I call them pragmatic, and I wouldn't even call them free trade agreements in the sense we defined in the early 2000s. They are feasible trade agreements, and every agreement has its own feasibility test. The FTA with EFTA, the four EFTA countries, offers tariff concessions contingent upon $10 billion of investment in 10 years or 15 years, which is very unusual. So today's FTAs are more we like you, let's do business together, rather than a genuine FTA. And this is again true for all countries, not just for India. But the other point you raised about if you want to enter global value chains, how do you rationalize tariffs, especially for ingredients and components? That's been a long-standing debate, or a very intense debate between, frankly, the finance ministry in India and the industry ministry. So it's not just between international stakeholders in India, it's at the heart of the government. And there is some hope, and I do believe this is a combination of what I've heard and what I've read and what perhaps we should think in as well, that there will be some rationalization very early in the new government's, if this government comes back to office, of course, very early in the new government's term. Because minus that rationalization, India will simply not see the integration with global value chains that it has. And that's recognized.
So let me use that as a launchpad to actually turn to foreign relations, because implicit in this understanding is that India is going to not only become part of a global system, but is also rethinking its foreign relations, as you pointed out in your early remarks. relations. Now, India relations are the best they've been as long as I've been in this business. And those have been driven, I think, by two variables which have interacted so productively. There is an increase in US-China rivalry, which was many years in the coming, but has finally come. And there has been an upsurge in scratchiness in Sino-Indian relations because of all the developments post-2020. So Alyssa, let me ask you, when you look at these two sort of relationships which are troubled, is this a sustainable basis for us to maintain a relationship with India? I mean, I understand the Kautilya principle of enemy of my enemy is my friend and so on and so forth. But how do you see the long-term incentives to sustain this relationship, even beyond the China factor?
Well, I don't think the China factor is the only basis for an expanded relationship. But I do think that it has provided a backdrop in which, as Ashok said, India has decided that it knows and understands where its partners and supporters will be. And that has given way to an intensified kind of consultation, an intensified level of partnership. Again, it's not an alliance, but there are close partner behaviors and consultations short of an alliance. I think that's likely to continue. I don't see a reversal of that. I am not sure that we'll see an intensification to a treaty alliance. I still don't think that that's on the cards. But I also think that the economic piece is an important parallel component of what's happened in the India-US relationship. There are many problems and challenges, long-standing trade disputes in the relationship. Some of them have been solved, many of them remain. I think there's a lot to give trade negotiators plenty to talk about for years and years.
Long may keep.
Yeah, and some of these are like mind-numbingly technical kinds of issues. But I do think, the size of the Indian economy, its continued growth, there's a lot of interest in seeing. The Indian government has sought investment in the Indian economy, and that has also been a reason to keep American companies engaged and returning, to try to negotiate what their best opportunity might be for the Indian market or for India as a hub for markets nearby. And I think that's going to continue to be an important piece of what ties the countries together. It's a strong and growing economic relationship. The trade volume in goods and services is nearly 200 billion. 12, 13, 14 years ago, it was hovering around 100 billion. I mean, that's a good story. There's still problems, right? I'm not pretending there aren't, but this is really quite something at a time when there is a politically led push, certainly in the United States, to think about friendshoring, supply chain relocation to places that do not produce the same kind of risk or uncertainty for American companies. So I think that's another piece of it. So I think the China factor has helped bring the countries together, there's no doubt. And should that change, I think there still is an economic logic to the relationship.
So tying the pieces for us together, Ashok, I mean, you worked with all the principals in the current government as they reformulated their relationship with the United States. What is India's long-term vision for its partnership with the US? We understand the building blocks, we understand the economic block, the strategic block, and so on and so forth. But where can this go? Where would India like to see it go?
Look, we are fundamentally comfortable with the world order that the US undergirded and has undergirded for the past half century. We want tweaks here and there. We want to use Security Council, all of that, but we are fundamentally much more comfortable with this than we were with a few years ago. And certainly we would be if the Chinese created an alternative, especially in Asia. And you can see that, trade disputes will continue to happen and will always be there. But the currency of economic partnership today is, I would say, resilient and reliable supply chains and technology arrangements. And in both of those, the Indians and the Americans are working together more than they ever have. Well, there is some competition, I'm not denying that. Second is also burden sharing. We recognize that the US will, for various reasons, including domestic pressure and more interrogative politics at home, will not be able to devote the resources to expeditionary missions abroad and to foreign policy generally that it has in the past many decades. So you're seeing that in Indo-Pacific, you're seeing that in the Indian Ocean, you're seeing that most recently in the Middle East, and what's happened with the pirates after the Iranian auxiliaries got to work. You have a US-led naval mission in one part of the ocean. You have a parallel Indian mission, which is not part of a treaty alliance or something, which is doing just the same thing, and obviously in coordination, and is very active in the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. And I expect to see much more of this happening, not just in theatres close to India's shores, but gradually further afield. This has been called the most consequential relationship for India anywhere in the world, and quite honestly, I think that the consequence of the relationship will only grow.
Well, that is reassuring to hear, because I think at the back of the minds of many observers in the US, there's clearly a delight that the relationship has transformed in these ways. But there are still questions out there about where we can go. And if you tell me that at the end of the day, India is still fundamentally comfortable with a US-led international order, despite whatever efforts it may make here and there to sort of improve its status position.
Actually, there are Cold War warriors in this town. There are Cold War warriors and retired diplomats in that town who sit back and talk about USS Enterprise. But the fact is, I'm quoting my friend and my previous boss, Mr. Shankar. If you look at Indians and where do they want to study? Where do they want to go for a holiday? Frankly, not St. Petersburg, even though St. Petersburg is a lovely city. Where do they want to send their children for education? Where do they want to source their technology from? Where do they want to source their investments or capital from? It's largely the US and allied countries. And essentially, half a dozen or 6 dozen foreign policy pundits in the national capital cannot alter the course of foreign policy if society is moving in another direction.
Sure. Ashok, let me ask you, what do you see as the future of Indian democracy? By which I mean, for the longest time, India was very comfortable with what was called the Congress system. Congress was hegemonic in Indian politics for many decades. It appears like we might be transitioning now to a BJP system, and the BJP is hegemonic. And we will have to wait and see what the results bring with respect to South India, in particular, whether the party can penetrate the South. But if we are on the cusp of a transition to a BJP system, do we have reasons to be concerned about the health of Indian democracy? And I don't mean that simply about concerns about minorities and so on and so forth, though that is commonplace. But the question of a party that has overwhelming power at the center, that has an extraordinary mandate vis-a-vis civil society, other arms of government, the press, and so on and so forth. What does this tell us when we think about Indian democracy 5 years from now, when we might be having a revisitation of this conversation?
As an Indian, I must confess to being disappointed that my country has never had a stable two-party system. The Congress dominated, other parties, including the BJP, were very small and inconsequential. The BJP suddenly surged 2014 onwards, and that was the moment the Congress chose to commit suicide and has become a very small party today. So, as someone committed to Indian democracy as an Indian citizen, irrespective of which party I vote for, this is disappointing because one would like to see competition. It keeps governments on their toes. Having said that, it's not just an opposition party that keeps the government or the ruling party or the ruling system on its toes. There are other correctives. I'll give you one example. Mr. Modi is not just popular in India, today he's revered. I don't use that word loosely. He is extremely popular. He's most popular Prime Minister I have seen in my lifetime. Perhaps Nehru in the early 50s or something, you compare. Yet, he's the overwhelming favorite to win this election. Yet, even he has had to change 101 of his incumbent 303 MPs. He's had to change them because he recognizes that even with his popularity, perhaps the hostility to them or some ill feeling towards them vis-a-vis their performance as MPs could lead to a problem. So, democracy has this way of offering correctives and of telling the ruling party or the Prime Minister of India that you need to take some steps to sort of compensate for excesses. So I'm reasonably confident that a country as pluralistic and heterogeneous as India will continue to retain that internal sense of debate and contestation and argument. It will take a different form. It will use a different medium. Perhaps it will speak more Hindi. Okay. But it will be there.
Sir, do you have any thoughts on this question? Because this is very much on the minds of people here as they look at a third world economy.
It's definitely on the minds of I think, some Americans and parts of the U.S. government and U.S. civil society organizations. Again, it's the question of how does India conceptualize itself? How does it keep or maintain space for its minorities? Freedom of expression, what does that look like? Can you disagree publicly? I mean, the kinds of concerns that you see people raising should be concerns for Indian citizens too. If you criticize the ruling party, are there repercussions? These are the kinds of concerns that you hear in the United States. So,
those are concerns in India as well. I mean, there are excesses, I can't deny that. And those are concerns in India as well. And quite honestly, freedom of speech, much more than the federal government, the challenge is the level of state governments across parties. This is a fact. But broadly, as an Indian, I do have faith in the sort of the power of India to reconcile and move towards the center, which is fairly evident.
And I guess India's last and best defense is always its complexity. Anyone who tries to overwhelm that complexity is going to have a very, very hard time mastering it.
Caste census, seeking to divide Indian society or seeking to aggravate grievances, as well as calling for literally a redistribution of wealth. Well, he's called for a survey of where the wealth is that will eventually lead to a redistribution of wealth should they come to power. Isn't that something that America has actually stood against in many societies around the world? And why is the U.S. government not, concerned about that rhetoric?
We don't have a U.S. government representative for us, but do you want to sort of just address this?
This is a campaign promise. It's not a policy. I don't know that this would, I've never seen the USG make a public statement on something that is kind of just out there. It's not an actionable policy.
It may be unhelpful actually for us to prematurely offer thoughts on campaign commitments. But the point is well taken. I mean, if this becomes policy, obviously, it will have some foreign policy consequences, and presumably someone will address it. Yes, sir.
Here.
Dev Carr, formerly of the IMF and chief economist of a think tank called Global Financial Integrity. My question to Ashok is, how do you reconcile Prime Minister Modi's often oft-stated policy, "Sabke Saath, Sabke Vikas," meaning with everybody and with everybody's, we are for everybody's improvement, with the fact that he has no minorities basically to speak of in his cabinet? I find it's very hard to reconcile the two. How would you do that?
Could you take one more question as well, because I want to give everyone a chance.
Ashok, and anybody wants to take this. My name is Akshat Vishal, and I'm an international development specialist. The story which we are often missing out between India-America relationship is how these two countries are coming together, addressing one of the major threat to our globe, which is climate change. A lot has been achieved in that direction since Obama administration, especially when Prime Minister Modi came into power, and it has remained consistent. How much do we see this continuing, especially when India and America both trying to work together to elevate a lot of poor countries and global poverty, specifically in Africa?
So what is the question?
So how much this agenda is going to continue addressing the climate change issues and poverty reduction in all the continents, specifically in Africa?
And that's cooperatively that we do this. Why did you take the first one, Ashok? Minorities
So,
question.
the minority question and Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and the two issues you raise both exist. So, Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas could refer to just public policies which are frankly accessible to all citizens. So, if rural roads are being built, if almost every Indian today has some sort of a house, a decent house, modern sewage, kitchen and all that, it obviously means every Indian who's a Hindu, Muslim, minority, whatever. So you have seen prosperity, if I can use that word, or certainly basic minimum dignity being made available in terms of concrete deliverables to a vast, very overwhelming number of Indian citizens, perhaps almost universal, irrespective of community. So in that there's been no discrimination, and there should not be, of course. In terms of the conversation, I wouldn't go into, the problem, second question you asked me about the relationship with the minorities does not really get resolved if you make two Muslims ministers. There's a broader question you're asking, and I'll tackle that. The conversation between the BJP and India's principal minority is far from complete or far from adequate. I admit that. It's clear. And there's a still broader question about the rise of the new Muslim middle class in India and how contemporary India will accommodate that. You see, at the time of independence, the Muslim elite, much of it, the Muslim middle class, much of it, left for Pakistan, which is why our middle class hardly had Muslim representation for many years. And there were a few sort of old Nawabs who stayed back, but it was very limited. So if you looked at the civil service in the 60s or 70s, it was hardly any Muslims. It was seen as much. Those who would have been serving in those positions were sitting in Pakistan. And the same goes for the corporate sector. But over the past 20 odd years, since the economy began to open up, this is a phenomenon which has been advanced by Modi's reforms, advanced by Manmohan Singh's reforms. There has been the emergence of a new Muslim middle class. People from ordinary families, first generation middle class, coming into professions such as corporate sector, journalism, academia, and so on. And this, of course, this is a very positive phenomenon. But how India as a society accommodates this new middle class, Muslim middle class, people have its own aspirations, its own opinions as well, is, I would say, I wouldn't say it's a challenge, but it's a big phenomenon ahead of the country. And it's what the BJP does with one or two Muslim ministers is only one small sub-segment of this larger phenomenon, which will be something which any student of India will need to watch and study in the next decade, I would say.
Melissa, would you like to take the question about what we can do with climate change,
Yeah.
property reduction? So,
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the BJP, and this has been a passion for Prime Minister Modi, the idea of being a leader globally in sustainability, in keeping India a country that is attentive to its environment, part of, it's pretty interesting. Take a look at the new BJP election manifesto. There's a whole section in there on sustainability, ecotourism. India is a place that is leading the world on these kinds of questions. So I think that would continue to be an area of priority for India. I think your question was about collaboration with the United States in this space. The United States is having an election this year, by the way, in case you didn't know. And I think if the Democrats remain in power, that will continue to be an area of deep cooperation with India, as it has been. I think the jury is out on whether that will be a priority for a second Trump administration. It certainly was not a priority for the first Trump administration, which pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement. So I think the answer to your question about the cooperation part hinges on what unfolds in the United States.
Yes.
Thank you. Namaste. Hello. My name is Anjali Galati with Georgetown University and United Nations Association. Thank you for talking about India's economic prospects and growing on the world stage. Recently, the former Reserve Bank of India Governor Subbarao has said that India becoming the third largest country in the world by economy by 2029 doesn't necessarily mean that India won't still be a poor country, as the largestness of the economy can be accounted for partly by the 1.4 billion people being factors of production. Take Saudi Arabia becoming a rich country doesn't necessarily mean it became a developed nation. So even though India is right now the fifth largest economy at $3.7 trillion GDP, it's 139th in per capita income at $2,600 and still the poorest among the BRICS and G20 nations. So while accelerating the growth rate in the near future, how do you predict that the benefits will be shared, and how will equity be emphasized by the Modi administration, if at all?
This is why everybody cares about jobs and job creation. Absolutely.
What you're saying is absolutely correct. I mean, that's what we've been discussing here. Mr. Modi, for instance, talks about India being a developed country by 2047. It stands to reason that he recognizes it's not developed today. And even if our GDP doubles, we will, per capita income will rise, but we will still have a lot of people who may not be absolutely wretchedly poor, because I think the wretched poverty of my childhood is probably behind us. But there are people who are just short of being poor, and they still able to get against existence and will continue, and that has to be addressed. But look, there have been gains as well, and not just in the past 10 years, but even in the period before that. Gains that have been created or have come because of economic growth and what it has allowed us to do. So if you look at the fact that almost every Indian, as far as I know, has a house today, which was not the case even when I was growing up. Okay? It's a small house, it's not a mansion, but it's a house, it's something to stay in. If you look at nutrition, there are still problems, but we're discussing nutrition today, not hunger. Now, should we be discussing malnutrition? Obviously not. But I would say it's an achievement vis-a-vis where we were discussing hunger, absolutely. Now at least we're discussing nutrition, and we need to address that. So there has been progress, and that progress has only got accelerated as the economy has grown. Do we need to do more? Absolutely we do, but minus growth, we will not have the resources to do it.
I think that's the point I would underscore, that if you do not have the growth, then you cannot address the distributional issues. And we've seen what 40 odd years of subpar growth get to distribution. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Tellis. This is Kishore, Center for Security, Innovation and Technology at American University. My question is regarding India's position in the next 5 years. If you zoom out and look at its global positioning in a likely scenario of turbulent waters, in a likely scenario of Taiwan conflict in the Taiwan Strait, what kind of shockwaves it might create in terms of global electronic supply chain, and where would India be in that position? Considering that in the past two conflicts, most recent conflicts, India has very carefully been able to hedge through and
Sorry, which conflict?
Taiwan. If there is a conflict in the next 5 years, because it is a hub of global electronic supply chain, so how would that impact India? Where would India's position be at that moment?
Let me take a second question as well, yes.
Akshat Singh from CSIS India Chair. Thank you, Ashley, for a wonderful session. My question is to Ashok. On the subject of global supply chains, you talked about rationalization. What exact rationalization are we talking about here? Is it GST, labor code, custom clearances, and so on? Second question, there was a recent report by the Chief Economic Advisor of India where he puts numbers on India's total reliance on China for global supply chains. The numbers were pretty staggering. Over 20% of all foreign inputs are from China. What sort of reforms can we look forward to in terms of supply chain diversification? Thank you.
Multiple questions. Let's start with Taiwan. This is turning out to be a bit of a decade from hell. As I said, unlike China's growth, which took place in a benign geopolitical environment, India's growth in the 2020s is taking place amid upheaval. If there is a conflict over Taiwan, how will India respond? It depends on the nature of the conflict. Conflict is calibrated, response will also be calibrated. Okay? And that's true for the US as well. But certainly there would be disruption. I don't expect India to be directly involved in the conflict. But if the US, for instance, gets involved, I do expect India to take over sea patrolling in other parts of the Indian Ocean, as has happened in the past. For instance, and we certainly would not want Taiwan to be annexed by China with a show of military force, because that would have implications for Asian geopolitics, well beyond the semiconductor ecosystem. Even if the semiconductor ecosystem miraculously is dispersed across many geographies, it will have, even if that were to happen, Taiwan's annexation will have implications. It would make China much more uncritical as a power to overwhelming. In terms of rationalization, what I was talking about is rationalization of tariffs, especially tariffs for components, which in some cases are much higher than they frankly need to be, and do not allow for sufficient movement of supply chains to India and value addition within India. And this is the debate which the Department of Revenue and the Department of Industry, not just debate, it's an argument, keep having, because the Department of Revenue wants to maximize revenue coming in. The Department of Industry says take a more rational view, because this could lead to greater value addition within India. So, what was the other question you asked about?
Supply chain diversification.
Supply chain from China. Look, China will remain a very important trading partner for all of us. It's not going away. The question is, in terms of strategic purchases, defense, power infrastructure, telecom infrastructure, in terms of emerging technologies, the semiconductor ecosystem, can you create alternatives to China? Some of those alternatives within your own country. That is the key question. Whether I'm buying a cheap toy from China or not is less important than whether my government or my power utility is buying equipment from China or not. So, of course, I want Indians to make toys as well, that's a separate matter. But so, it's not that the world can stop trading with China. That's not going to happen. But in key areas, in critical commodities and products and technologies, can you de-risk yourself from China? Can you, get off the China drug? That is the key question.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Nicole McCloskey. I'm an associate at the Asia Group. And off of Akshat's question on supply chain diversification, I think if we look at India today, we can kind of see what sectors they're focusing on based on their PLI schemes. Over the next 5 years, what do you all think India will focus on in terms of its PLI schemes? And what sectors can we expect India to expand those PLI schemes in? How much will those PLI schemes be decided on by India's and the world's dependence on Chinese supply chains. So my question is are the PLIs, what sectors do you believe PLI schemes will focus on in the next 5 years if we see a returning Modi government? And do you foresee more PLI schemes being put in place over the next 5 years? Or any being kind of phased out based on their performance so far?
I'll take a second question as well.
Hi, thank you for a very good session. I'm Amita Sarkar. I belong to the Indian Chamber of Commerce called the CII. My question is for Elisa. In your perception, what could be the biggest stumbling block or a potential fault line as the country surges towards becoming a developed country, and something for us to watch out for? Thank you.
Do you want to take the first question of PLIs and the future of PLIs?
So, well, I do expect PLIs to be expanded and to grow into other areas. What exactly are PLIs? These are production-linked incentive programs which offer a subsidy if you move manufacturing or get it manufactured in India. They are a recognition that India hasn't adequately carried out factor market reforms, and sometimes a little more expensive than it should be as a manufacturing destination. But it's supposed to be a sweetener, initial sweetener. It has worked in mobile phones and consumer electronics. I expect consumer electronics, semiconductors, emerging technologies, especially technologies important for the green economy and for climate adaptation and climate change, including electric vehicles. I expect these are the areas that the discussion focus on. These are areas where it does not want to build dependencies vis-a-vis China. To cite one example, Tesla is being welcomed to India, BYD has been kept out of India. Even in areas such as electric vehicles, India needs to be first. The direction. PLI schemes will also come in areas where potentially have a lot of job creation ability. Textiles, of course, also toys. I expect toys to be because that's an area Prime Minister Modi has been pushing on. We can really grow there. So it's either high-tech areas where you have a China problem, or job creation areas.
Just one quick thing on this.
Yes,
I was
please.
very surprised to see in the BJP's new election manifesto an emphasis on lab-grown diamonds. I didn't know this was going to be a priority area, but it's in there, so they may be telegraphing something here too.
It is. We've had a problem.
That's for industrial reasons?
Also for jewelry. They're cheaper, obviously. You see, as you know, Surat and Mumbai are big hubs and big users of diamonds. And we've had a problem sourcing diamonds, especially after the Ukraine war. We've had the problem, the Belgians also have that problem. So there's always a market for finding a alternative at home. And if people are satisfied with lab-grown diamonds, well, why not?
Okay, I'm looking to invest retirement account.
So
Go
to
ahead.
the question on fault lines, that's a really interesting question, and just thinking ahead, some of the areas that remain big challenges in the US-India economic dialogue, and that also have potential to be challenges in some of the freedom of expression set of concerns, revolve around digital platforms. India is now the largest market for many different platforms of companies that are based in the United States. The US has pretty freewheeling speech laws. That is not true in India, so that's a source of tension. And I would expect that as some of these, again, big questions remaining about data localization, digital rights, how India will put in place its guidelines and laws surrounding the digital economy, I would expect that these could be areas of potential future challenge. They already are, they just have not been fully decided. Some things are still out, the legislation is still moving. I would look at that space as a potential fall time.
Well, on that note, I have to call this meeting to an end. All good things come to an end. I want to thank all of you for coming in person.